All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the biannual California Ocean Litter Strategy webinar. We are honored to be joined this morning by Congressman Alan Lowenthal, who is serving his 5th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing California's 47th district, which includes parts of Eastern Los Angeles County and Western Orange County. Prior to joining Congress, he served a 2-decade tenure as first a Long Beach, California City Council member, and then as a California legislator. Representative Lowenthal is an advocate for the marine debris issue and a co-sponsor of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. Thank you so much for joining us.
Let me just get back. Thank you. Thank you. And I want to, first and foremost, I want to thank, you can see the California Ocean Protection Council, NOAA, and all of the important stakeholders that are convening this update and for your critically important work to address plastic pollution and marine debris. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. You know, we're here because the waste and recycling system in this country is broken, and plastic pollution is now at crisis levels. The widely accepted approach used to be that the solution to pollution was dilution. We now know that this overly simplistic approach in actuality just pushes our problems onto a different community or to a different generation. You know, I raise that because we've just recently seen the observation of tens of thousands of dumped DDT barrels off the California's southern coast. This is a shameful legacy of industrial pollution impacting our oceans, our environment, our wildlife, our public health, which our generation and the next generation will have to deal with. You know, it's clear that we have not really learned from our previous mistakes. For too long, we've treated our oceans as a dumping ground for us to forget and to ignore our pollution. While I've been aware and concerned with the issue of plastic waste for decades, I have to credit my early involvement to my friend and neighbor, Dr. Charles Moore. Charlie Moore is the founder and the executive director of the group called Algalita, which is based in Long Beach, California. He's credited with the discovery and the early research into the Pacific Garbage Gyre, or the garbage patch, as it's commonly called. This greatly, when Charlie came to me and showed me pictures of this garbage patch, greatly influenced my efforts in the California state legislature, and where I started to lead efforts to ban styrofoam packaging, limit plastic bag, because limiting plastic bag pollution. But my desire to address this issue only grew when I came to Congress, and the connection with the climate crisis and the production of and the waste impacts on frontline and fence line communities was only beginning to become more clear. A little over 2 years ago, maybe now 2.5 years ago, I went on a trip to Antarctica through the National Geographic, and there I joined scientists who opened up fish and birds and showed me the immense amount of plastic that these animals had digested. You know, it was truly overwhelming for me to see the amount of plastic that is stretched to even the most remote parts of this planet. And I came back more determined than ever to do something comprehensive to address the plastic waste crisis. After a year-long process of taking public comments, I was immensely proud to introduce the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act last year with my friend and colleague, Senator Tom Udall from New Mexico. I was proud now to reintroduce this bill just last month with Senator Merkley and Representative Clark. This bill is the most comprehensive plastic waste legislation ever introduced in Congress. I'm excited to see that the California Ocean Litter Prevention Strategy follows the same approach and priorities as the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. We here know that plastic pollution and waste crisis is not simply a matter of marine litter, and that the solution to addressing this crisis must be on source reduction. Like the litter prevention strategy, my legislation calls for producers to be responsible for the end use of their own products, incorporating minimum recycled content standards and investing in our domestic recycling infrastructure. We are now in this bill creating the structure and incentive to build better products and to close the loop for a circular economy. Also, like the litter prevention strategy, my bill seeks to ban commonly polluting plastic items like plastic bags and styrofoam in packaging and foodware, and to replace them with more sustainable alternatives. It encourages reuse, standardizes recycling, and labeling across the country. Further, this legislation seeks to address the pervasive issue of tobacco waste and marine debris from fishing gear that the appropriate federal agencies study and provide recommendations to the best approach to address these issues. Since initially introducing this legislation last year, many of these policies, including extended producer responsibility, minimum recycled standards, and environmental justice protection, have been introduced in literally dozens of state legislatures, and this movement is growing. It is critically important that we enact policies now to address this crisis. As the oil and gas industry seeks to further make up their lost revenues from energy and the transportation sectors in petrochemicals and plastics, this issue is only going to get worse unless we act now to build a more sustainable economy. I look forward to seeing the California Ocean Litter Strategy stakeholders organize a blueprint and actions for California that not only other states can emulate, but the nation can follow as well. I will continue to fight at the federal level to help you achieve these goals so that we may begin to address the plastic pollution crisis. Thank you for having me, and I'm glad to welcome everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative Lowenthal. We appreciate those opening remarks. And welcome everyone again to the Ocean Litter Strategy webinar. I'm Sherry Lippiat, the California Regional Coordinator for the NOAA Marine Debris Program, and I'm part of the team facilitating this webinar, along with Holly Wire, who's the Marine Pollution Program Manager with the California Ocean Protection Council, Tanya Torres, the California Sea Grant Extension Fellow with the NOAA Marine Debris Program, and James Pierce with the OPC, who's running our slides and keeping everything moving smoothly. So starting just with some housekeeping items, this webinar is being recorded and streamed to OPC's YouTube channel, where you can go back and view it again if you like. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and we encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A, and everyone will have the ability to comment on and upvote other people's questions, and that upvoting will help us to prioritize the questions that come in for the Q&A portion. Next slide, please. So our agenda, we've already had our opening remarks. We'll do some quick icebreaker polls followed by 2 guest presentations. The first by Evan Schwartz on California Coastal Commission's Plastic Pollution Reduction Guidance Project. And the second guest presentation by Tony Hale and Shelley Moore on the Trash Monitoring Playbook. Then we'll have our ocean litter strategy and goal-based work group updates, state and federal legislative updates, other agency updates, and then lastly, Q&A for as much time as we have left before wrapping up at noon. So I'm going to go ahead and open the first poll here. Give me just 1 second. So that should be launched. First here, we're just interested in getting a feeling for where our audience is joining us from. So I'll give folks a few seconds to answer this poll. All right, it looks like we have most folks have voted. And so I'll share these results. And as you can see, most people are joining us from the South Coast with a big sort of Bay Area and Sacramento contingent. And it's always great to see some participants from outside of California. And so I'll just launch the next poll. And so this one's a little bit more nuanced, maybe even a little bit nerdy for those plastic pollution researchers out there. But we know from published research that our best estimates for the total amount of plastic floating at the sea surface only accounts for about 1% of the amount that we think is entering the ocean every year. So this question is, where is the missing plastic? And you have to choose only one option. So please choose the reservoir that you think is the biggest sink for the missing plastic. And don't worry, these are anonymous. So I'll give a few more seconds for folks to answer this one. All right, and so these are the results. It looks like on the seafloor or incorporated into sediments is the most common response. And a few folks, it seems like, do have some plastic utensils in their junk drawer. Okay. So thanks everyone for that. And I think we'll move right on to our guest speakers. So next slide, please, James. So Eben Schwartz is the Marine Debris Program Manager for the California Coastal Commission. And I'll let Eben orient us to the long title he has for this project. And just a quick reminder to please put questions into the Q&A and upvote questions that you would like to have answered. So go ahead, Eben.
Thank you, Sherry. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining and thank you for inviting me to present on this. I am talking about a brand new project that we have undertaken or are about to undertake at the Coastal Commission to work on formalizing plastic pollution reduction measures within the larger programmatic work of the Coastal Commission. And this is such a new project that these slides are going to be super boring looking. So I apologize in advance for not having time to make these prettier. I'm sure it's a new project, as I said, so I'm sure within 6 months, there's going to be much nicer pictures involved. Next slide, please. So just to orient everyone a little bit on the Coastal Commission, we are a state agency, but we're a pretty small state agency that I'm sure many people on this call know about, but a lot of people in the state don't. So to give you an overview of who we are governed by the California Coastal Act, which when it was put into law in 1976. And essentially we regulate and enforce the Coastal Act on all development within the coastal zone of California. So any development which is defined extremely broadly in the Coastal Act has to have a coastal development permit, which either comes from us, the State Coastal Commission, or from a local agency that has what's called a local coastal program that has been affirmed by the Coastal Commission. But all development requires these coastal development permits to move forward within the coastal zone. So we do a lot of planning and regulatory work on some of the most precious land in the world, and which has led us to lots of interesting situations that I'm sure many of you have heard of. We also work closely with the State Water Resources Control Board to implement Coastal Non-Point Source Water Pollution Control Project, or program, sorry. And within this agency, which is not very large at all, we're only about 160 staff people, there is a small group of us within the agency that works on public education programs. And the public education program has a long history of working on plastic pollution. We started the state's Coastal Cleanup Day program back in 1985, expanded that to the year-round Adopt a Beach program. And for many years, we have aspired to bringing plastic pollution work into more of the core programmatic work of the Coastal Commission, to really implement some measures within the larger work of the Commission to help support the work that we're all doing. Next slide, please. So this actually has been in the works for quite some time, but during the process of the ocean litter strategy development, a colleague of mine, Cassidy, and I were talking about different ways that we could implement this. One small way was this first action, to establish and improve management of trash recycling and compost receptacles in high-use areas, where we actually have direct authority. We can regulate that through permits that come before us. But looking deeper into the strategy, there are multiple objectives that the Coastal Commission could support through our regulatory work, if we were to really choose to do so. And so I've listed some of them here, but in the interest of time, I'll just let you read them. And we started working at the Coastal Commission in the background to think about ways that we might really implement a project that could formalize actions that could not only help us fulfill these objectives within the ocean litter strategy, but really to go above and beyond that to really make this a regular part of our permitting and regulatory and enforcement process. And as we started to do that, we realized that this has actually already been in process to a certain degree for some time now. Next slide, please. So we've already taken a number of actions that have helped reduce plastic pollution in the coastal zone. So for example, one of our enforcement actions against the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, which was primarily around them denying beach access, we included a stipulation in the enforcement action that they had to come up with a plan to reduce single-use plastics at the hotel, including removing all single-use plastics from guest rooms, which was pretty neat and just sort of opened our eyes to what we could accomplish through enforcement actions like that. There's also been planning activity ongoing with various partners. We work in conjunction with local governments and other state agencies like Caltrans on their coastal development permits. And on the North Coast, one of our planners had worked with Caltrans to replace plastic storm drain flood guards, which you can see a picture of there in the bottom, with non-plastic alternatives. So unbeknownst to most of us, those things are made from plastic mesh, which becomes brittle and breaks apart and adds microplastics to the environment. And they're now replacing them with non-plastic alternatives to eliminate that source of plastic. Next slide, please. And a more recent action that actually just took place this past year were plans for the Dana Point Harbor Expansion Project, where we added a special condition in their permit allowing them to expand the harbor to include a number of different plastic pollution reduction measures, including increased educational signage around no smoking and trying to eliminate cigarette butt litter from the area. That servicing plan for trash and recycling and compost collection bins along the harbor, which I talked about earlier as one of the actions that we're the lead on. But if we can make sure that the servicing plan accommodates the highest usage moments, then we can eliminate, or at least largely eliminate, overflowing trash bins, which we know is another source of coastal pollution. And then a big one was that they committed to participating in the Rethink Disposable program for restaurants within the harbor to replace single-use plastics with reusable goods, which, as we've heard from Clean Water Fund and Clean Water Action in the past, is a huge reduction of single-use plastics into the environment. But all of these actions have been taken on sort of an ad hoc basis. They come up when we find willing permit applicants, or there are special conditions that we need to enact. And what we really wanted to do was to take actions like this and formalize them throughout all of our regulatory and enforcement work wherever possible. So as part of our new coastal zone management grant that we receive from NOAA every 5 years, we added this new program as a priority project for the next 5 years. So beginning in July 1st, when the new grant cycle begins, we are undertaking our new project. Next slide, please. And here it is. It's got this really long name, Plastic Pollution Reduction Guidance Project, which doesn't even make for a nice acronym, but what can you do? We're a state agency. So there's 2 phases to the project, really. The first phase will take about 3 years, where we develop the project working with a team at the Coastal Commission and in conjunction with other partners like the State Water Resources Control Board, where we will start to examine our permitting process and our enforcement process, and to identify those points of intervention in those processes where we can best make plastic pollution reduction measures work. And once we're able to do that, we can develop a set of best management guidance, document to help evaluate our permits and LCPs and enforcement actions, which we will then take to the Coastal Commission for formal adoption at the end of 3 years, which is actually a fairly aggressive schedule for our projects. But the great part about that last part of our development is that the Coastal Commission process is a public process where the public gets a chance to weigh in and help influence what we do. And so our hope is that we will get lots of guidance along the way, so that the adoption process is fairly smooth. And then phase 2 is implementation, where we will both train staff on new guidance, but also implement the guidance into our permits and different processes, and undertake a pretty robust public education effort to publicize the different actions we've taken under the new guidance, let people know, let applicants know what they might want to look for in their applications to help reduce plastic on the front side of things, and educate the public about actions that we can all take in these different efforts we undertake around both development and life in general, to reduce plastic before it has a chance to become plastic pollution. So there we go. That's our new project, which, as I said, is not even underway yet, but we're very excited about, and we've got a lot of support from leadership and from the Coastal Commission itself to make this as robust as possible. So next slide. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, Thanks, Evan.
Sure.
It's really exciting for us to get this information kind of hot off the press, and just to see the Coastal Commission getting really creative in how to increase the scope of a lot of the ocean litter strategy actions that are already ongoing. I haven't seen any questions come into the Q&A. I know Tanya's monitoring those, so folks, please enter any questions if you have them. But in the meantime, Evan, I'm wondering if there are ways that our ocean litter strategy participants can participate. I mean, I know you mentioned something about public comment, but I'm wondering if there's like opportunities in the trainings or kind of working directly on the implementation of these permit requirements.
It's unlikely that there'll be public participation in the actual permitting process, which happens between the permit applicants and our staff. And it's not until those actions are brought to the commission itself for a vote that the public has a chance to participate in that part of it. We will be looking for input undoubtedly as we go through this. You know, one of the things we confront when we try to undertake a project like this is that plastic pollution, as we all know, there is more information coming out about plastic pollution on a daily basis, and the report that was just issued last week is already out of date because we've learned new things. And the same is true of what we want to do for reduction measures. So this is going to be an iterative process where we can come up with some ideas to begin with, but you know, I'm anticipating that the guidance is largely going to be, well, let's get creative on what this project might be itself. That said, we are going to be looking for input, and we'll be reaching out to various stakeholders along the way for advice or ideas, or you know, that'll be a big part of what I'm doing to make sure that we're bringing the most current and relevant information to the group within the commission itself that's going to be developing this guidance.
Great. And Tanya, I think we have about 1 more minute if there's any other questions that came into the chat.
There was a question. Actually, I have 2 questions, but the first one was, how much does the plastic pollution reduction guidance project cost, and what's funding the project?
How much does it cost? It is part of our new coastal zone management grant, and it's actually a public document that's up on our website. If anybody wants to look, it's coastal.ca.gov. I'll drop it into the chat there. And at the bottom, there are a bunch of highlights. And if you scroll to the right, you'll see our new 2021 to 2025 coastal zone management grant. And all of the specific numbers are in there. I don't actually know them off the top of my head, but primarily the cost of this program is going to be some of my staff time and some of the staff time of my colleagues at the commission to develop this effort.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan. I think that we are out of time. So we'll move on to our next presentation. Next slide, please, James. So our next presentation is from Tony Hale, who's the Program Director for Environmental Informatics at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Shelley Moore, who's a scientist with SFEI. So they'll be presenting on the Trash Monitoring Playbook project. So go ahead, Tony and Shelley.
All right, thank you, and welcome everybody. It's good to see that we have a lot of participants that are interested in trash. This project was basically a project we've done over the last 3 years. It was completed at the end of 2020, and I will talk about not necessarily what's in the playbook this time around, or we will talk about what's not necessarily in the playbook, but we'll talk about lessons learned. Next slide. So this project was funded by the Ocean Protection Council and also supported by the State Water Resources Control Board. The goal of this project was to take some known methods and, for monitoring trash in rivers and streams, and to test those methods. So what we did was we actually went to a variety of sites throughout California, in both Northern and Southern California, and we performed these assessments. So we performed all 4 methods at each site to see how well they compared to one another and how well they performed. We had a technical advisory committee, and we involved a lot of stakeholders. The products from this, which are available today through trashmonitoring.org, are a field testing plan, which has the results of all the comparisons, as well as that method, that trash monitoring methods and assessments playbook, which basically provides standard operating procedures for doing these methods in the field, along with some other important information. And we also have been doing a lot of outreach and training for this project as well. Next slide. So what some of the lessons learned I've got listed here. Some of them probably don't surprise you, others may, but we'll go over each one of these in just a little bit of detail. And if you have questions at the very end or want to follow up with us, please do. So next slide. One of the first important lessons that we learned is that it's extremely important to make sure you develop your questions ahead of time. You've oftentimes got management questions, which basically may be as simple as, are things getting better or worse? But how do you take that general question and build it into a scientific question that you can actually perform a method in the field and answer? So it's really important to formulate your questions ahead of time and know what you're trying to answer. Next slide. Next, size of the trash really does matter when you're doing assessments. Each one of these lines in this graph represent a different site and the number of passes at each site that were necessary in order to basically pick up all the trash. Some sites required 5 passes, other sites required only a couple. And if I can give you a really good example of why size matters, all the trash in the pictures on the right in those buckets were from that line that goes up to about 500 items. So there was a small volume of trash, but a large number of trash, and it took more passes to pick up that trash using the tally method. Next slide. We also did a comparison between flying a drone and looking at that imagery and identifying all the trash in that imagery versus actually walking the ground and enumerating the trash. So here we have where we didn't do anything. We didn't remove any items or anything. The first 2 bars on this graph show that the tally amount is much larger than what we got via the imagery. If we remove all the smaller pieces of trash items, the number starts getting a little bit closer. And then if we remove all the pieces and the paper that we found at a site, the number's even closer. So when we're talking about pieces, we're talking about smaller trash. So the lesson learned here is that with the UAS is it's really good at identifying larger pieces of trash. Next slide. Next, training is absolutely critical when performing these methods in the field. This graph shows the differences between 3 different teams. And also when team A took the trash back to the lab and counted it, you can see there's some variation. And so when you go out and you do some training, you can see that there's some improvement in these numbers. Next slide. So that's what this graph is aiming to show. And that is when you have teams like the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition in Southern California, who have been doing assessments for years and years and years, the differences in their measurements versus the team that was sent out to follow them were very small. But if you've got other types of groups that don't have as much training and or that are just starting their training process, you can see those numbers get a lot bigger. Next slide. Method relationships, and oftentimes one of the most limiting factors when you're deciding on a method is resources. So if there's a way we can find relationships between methods that may cost less, we can use that to our advantage. In this case, We compared the volume versus a qualitative visual score. So they would go out and they would look at the different sites, and they would give it a score between 1 and 12 based on the perceived amount of trash in that area. And then we compared that to the actual volume that was recorded for that area, and the relationship was pretty good. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my wonderful colleague, Tony Hale.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Shelley. What I would like to do is to talk a little bit about the tools that we created to help facilitate our field work. So as Shelley described, we were out there validating multiple methods, and we found a challenge to kind of keeping all the data, keeping track of all the data. So being technologists, we really wanted to make our job as easy as possible when it came to organizing the data. So we leveraged an Esri 123 survey tool, very simple to set up. And it really did help us to achieve a number of things, including being able to embed the teaching tools right into the data collection process. And that really helped to facilitate ongoing training and validation of the data. It also helped to structure the data, collect location data, which is so critical. Collecting imagery, the before and after imagery is so important, and the tools help to do that. And before, connectivity was always a challenge, but this also allows for offline access. So even if you're in remote areas without cell service, you can still use these tools. So we encourage people to think carefully about using these tools, even if they're kind of off the shelf. Next slide, please. Another thing that we discovered is that a trash density metric can allow different practitioners to look at their results in ways that can facilitate either broad comparability across different regions or allow you to move more easily between and among methods. So by that, we're talking about going beyond kind of qualitative assessments and getting down into something a little bit more quantitative, being able to translate those things into a gallon per square meter for the amount of trash collected, or for example, 5 cups per square feet, whatever it happens to be, being able to take that density metric and work it across those different assessments has impacts for different impacts for environmental concerns, public health, economic, recreation, etc. Next slide. So we're often asked which method is the best method. And the simple answer is really, it isn't about which is best, but which is most suitable. And that sounds very Darwinian, I know, but really it depends on what your monitoring question is, how many resources you have, what is the level of accuracy and precision that you're aiming for. So there are a number of different drivers, and it really depends on matching things together. And we do provide some insight in the playbook about how to guide you towards the appropriate method. Next slide, please. So now we're talking a little bit about what we call the afterglow, a lot of what has emerged since we published the playbook, and we wanted to share some findings there. So next slide, please. So we've found that there's a lot of attention on this project, particularly because we focus somewhat on crosswalking these results among different methods, and also we're using technology such as drones and artificial intelligence to find trash. So we found ourselves featured in Oracle and Forbes, ArcUser, Fast Company, and a number of different videos that are now being circulated in social media. And there's more still coming. So there seems to be a long afterlife for what we're doing here. Next slide. And so part of what we've learned from this is that there really is a strong belief in the ameliorative power of technology, the power of technology to help make things better. And we can call that the Star Trek effect, right? You kind of just talk some techno babble and you can solve whatever problem, whether it's a black hole that you're about to enter or plastics that are entering the ocean. And so that's a key thing, but we also found that people really do value the synoptic view of the landscape. So rather than looking at one assessment area and another assessment area as kind of like pinpricks on the larger landscape, you can really achieve a bigger view, a more comprehensive and universal view of what's happening in your vicinity by flying high and looking down on the landscape. And that's very attractive to people. Another thing is that resources are limited. So people are looking to innovate their way out of some resource constraints. And drones, quite frankly, are cheaper. You know, the drone we were using was about $2,500, an off-the-shelf drone. So knowing that it was within the range of possibility for people was also very attractive. And many people are already using drones, and more people are attracted to the use of machine learning and artificial technology as well. Next slide. Another thing that we found is that people are looking for the silver bullet. They want some single thing they can do and just kind of button it up and call it a day. But what we emphasize is that every method has its place, and having an interrelated suite of tools is more appropriate because you're going to be running into constraints with any method, whether it's resource constraints or where you can and can't fly, these types of things that you need to bear in mind. Another thing is that people do still believe in science. They do believe that having rigorous science to back up the data is so very, very important. And so what is appealing, I think, about the playbook is knowing that we were out in the field and we were quantifying things, measuring things. There's a field testing report that backs up a lot of this stuff, and that was very appealing. Another thing that we can share is that there were really different accuracy ratings for the algorithms that we developed. One for general trash in creeks and rivers achieved 50% accuracy. That might not sound so great, but that's good enough for a number of applications. And it is a very challenging thing when you consider that a bicycle sitting in a street is not trash, but a bicycle in a creek is trash. And it's a lot about context. And teaching a machine algorithm to detect trash in that circumstance is challenging. But by contrast with cigarette butts, we were able to achieve a 98% accuracy. And that has a lot to do with the consistency of the form factor and the narrowness of what we were looking for. So that's an important insight that's kind of at that meta level that we wanted to share with you. Next slide, please. So we wanted to remind you, we put it in the chat if you want to click on the link, but there's trashmonitoring.org is where you can go. We want to thank the funder of this work, the Ocean Protection Council. We also benefited from other additional funding for some of the artificial intelligence that we did with Oracle and Kinetica, and the US EPA also contributed. And the California Department of Public Health. So we had a number of people and organizations that were part and parcel of this. The Stormwater Monitoring Coalition and the Bay Area Stormwater Management Agencies Association also lent in-kind support. So this was very much a collective effort, and we thank you for your support.
Great, thanks so much, Tony and Shelley. A lot of good considerations and useful resources for the trash monitoring world here. We are right at time, and I don't know, I didn't see any questions come into the chat, so maybe I'll just encourage folks, if you have any questions, to enter those into the Q&A, and Tony and Shelley, if you don't mind, maybe you could type the responses to those.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Great.
Sorry for the super fast presentation, but we're
yeah, no, I'm impressed. You got through a lot of information very quickly. So now I think we will just turn it over to Tanya for the Ocean Litter Strategy Progress Update.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. You go to next slide, James. So here is the Ocean Litter Strategy timeline. The 6-year plan was created back in 2018 with built-in workshops every 2 years and update webinars every 6 months. So where we are right now, May of 2021, we are 3 years in, and we are at our halfway point. So we've got a great 3 years behind us and another great 3 years ahead of us. Go to the next slide, please, James. So to date, 65% of the actions in the Ocean Litter Strategy are being worked on, and almost 10% of the actions of the strategy have been completed, and there's only about a quarter that we have had no progress reported on, but that doesn't mean that they're not being worked on. We just maybe haven't received any reports. But this shows how much we've all accomplished in the last 3 years, and I'd really like to congratulate you all and thank you all for your hard work. Next slide, please, James. And so looking at progress reporting over the years, though the amount of reports that we receive is roughly the same, and that's that blue bar, the amount of actions that we have no reporting on has steadily decreased, and that's that yellow line, meaning that new actions are being taken on every reporting session. And we saw a big jump actually in just from last November to this May. And so I think in this last reporting period, we had at least 5 or 6 new actions that were reported on that had never been started before. So it shows that there's a continuous movement on working on these actions that we've all put together to try and work on this issue. Next slide, please. And so this graph is just an interesting breakdown of the progress reports that were submitted for this session, and it breaks it down by goal. So of the progress reports that were submitted to us this past month, most pertain to goal 1, followed by goal 6, and then goal 4, and then the others. But I thought it was interesting to show what we are receiving, because we really want to try and maximize the reporting in all the goals, so that we're able to evaluate strategy and all of our efforts. And so in an attempt to streamline the progress reporting process, we did transition to a Google form, and this was the newest, that was the new thing we did. We hadn't done it before, that those of you who had submitted progress reports had used, and we would like to take a moment to get a little feedback from those of you. So if you could please answer this poll question for us. We'd just like to know what your thoughts are, and we're always looking to improve where we can. So Sherry, if you want to bring up that poll. So those of you who submit progress reports to us, is this new progress reporting format an improvement? Please be honest if you liked the Google form better than the initial Word doc, or if you preferred going back to the Word document, and if you don't submit progress reports, don't worry about it. Okay. I think we can. Okay, most of you don't submit progress reports, but those that do, okay, majority likes the new Google form. Thank you. That really does help us. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm happy to introduce our work group leads. We did start having goal-oriented work groups late last year, and we had the second round back in March. These work group meetings are to offset these update webinars. And so I would like to highlight these wonderful women who have stepped up to be our work group leads. We have Joanne Brash, Erica Yelinsky, Jenny Stevenson, Sherry Lipiat, and myself, as well as Michaela Miller. But unfortunately, Michaela is no longer available to be a lead. So I'm happy to announce that we are looking for a new work group lead for goal 6. If anyone is interested, please reach out to find out more about what being a work group lead would entail. Our work group leads are going to give very brief recaps of the past meetings in March. And I'd like to remind everyone that we're still open for anyone to join these work groups. And so these updates that they're about to give will give you a good idea on the discussions that take place and what goes on in these work group meetings. So first up, we have Erica Yelinsky from the EPA, who co-leads the Goal 3 work group targeting waste management. Next slide, and you can take it away, Erica.
Okay, thanks so much, Tanya. Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here with all of you. So again, my name is Erica Yelinsky, and I'm co-leading this group with Jenny Stevenson. And I will be reporting on the meeting that we had in mid-March. Oh, next slide, please. So we really appreciate the great participation we had from NGOs, local, state, and federal agencies. So the first part of our meeting, we had 2 great presentations. One, which you just saw or heard from Evan Schwartz for Action 3.2.2 on the project that they'll be embarking on this summer. And then the second from the City of Oakland, Jennifer Stern talked about the City of Oakland's Adopt a Drain program. So I'm going to spend kind of my report out time talking a little bit, just a super brief overview of the presentation that Jennifer shared with us, and all of the images in my PowerPoint are from that one. So the City of Oakland Public Works Department started and adopted a drain program in the early 2000s. And since its inception, they've enlisted over 900 volunteers who've adopted over 1,400 of Oakland's storm drain inlets. So that's, I think, a little over 10% of the storm drains that the city manages. So this has really helped the city keep the inlets clear of trash and debris and keeping water flowing. And the city partnered with Esri, creating this Esri Hub, which also is a tool for community engagement. And you can see the dashboard and also the interactive map that shows the storm drains that have been adopted or need to be adopted. So they've really they've reduced trash going to the creeks. The program gives them credit towards trash reduction mandates as part of their stormwater permit. And I'm hoping maybe at a future meeting, they'll be able to share their results as well. Next slide, please. So we also talked, about priorities and challenges for our group, and acknowledging that some priorities have changed since the strategy was written into 2018, and a couple. We discussed some other forms that might be better suited, such as the Action 3.2.4, trash from encampments, that the California Water Quality Monitoring Council has an encampment work group focusing on this action. So that would be kind of a good forum for us to tap into. And they held a webinar earlier this spring that I'm guessing some of you participated in. And then in terms of packaging piece, we see that the Goal 1 work group is really diving into this. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So just moving forward, we looked at, what are some concrete steps that our group could take on. So trying to share Oakland's adopted drain program more broadly, and acting as a sounding board for the Coastal Commission project that Evan discussed. And we also identified some new partners for us to reach out to, such as the California Stormwater Quality Association. There were some potential next steps we also discussed that might help our efforts, such as gathering data on how much money is spent on trash litter cleanup, and then the opportunity for getting more industry representation on the infrastructure improvement action. And thank you so much for your time, and I will pass the mic back to Tanya.
Thank you, Erica. Yes, we really appreciate all the hard work you've done in getting our Goal 3 up and running. So I am going to be reporting out on the next few goals, Goal 4, Goal 5, and Goal 6. So for Goal 4, which is our research work group, we had quite a few partner updates that we went over in our work group. Wynn Calger came on to update us about OpenSpeki, the trash taxonomy, and the trash data treasure trove. OpenSpeki is a website to help people ID microplastic material types via Raman or FTIR. And he mentioned that it's had a lot of usage, about 200 hours every month, and that's really exciting. And that a manuscript is in progress and hopefully will be published this summer. For the trash taxonomy, it is a framework for relating different trash survey sheets. I know he's been spending a lot of time working on that as well. A publication is very close to being submitted. And then the trash data treasure trove is an open source database to house different trash data sets. And it's currently being worked on to be more user-friendly by adding features to search and filter the databases. So a lot of work is being done on trash data. Then we had a presentation by Scott Coffin from the State Water Boards about the microplastic method and regulatory toxicity threshold development efforts. This is in relation to SB 1422 that was passed in 2018. So far, they have a microplastic definition that has been adopted. The plan also calls to have have accredited laboratories and provide health-based guidance levels. They're working with more than 40 different organizations to standardize methods for drinking water, ocean water, fish tissue, and sediment. But there's a deadline that by July of this year, they are required to identify a standardized method for analyzing microplastic in drinking water. And the others will come later. And he mentioned, I think Leo Thornton also came on to explain a little more about her database. So she's from SQUIRP, and she developed a database of health effects studies to try and help inform all these decisions around the health guidance levels. And they're still trying to figure out, though, what these thresholds should be based on. A lot of conversations along that. And they mentioned that if the board doesn't feel comfortable with the state of the science, they may not necessarily adopt a specific threshold, but instead will present different options. And they also mentioned that the expert group will be adopting thresholds for ambient waters to look at ecological impacts, not just human health. And so the group had a small discussion around different actions that could be taken to achieve that, such as species sensitivity, distribution, and things like that. Then the conversation switched. Sherry Lippiat from the NOAA Marine Debris Program came to give us some updates around efforts going on about microfibers. So based on the microfibers workshop that was held last November, Materievolve published a report that summarizes microfibers issues in California. It provides an overview of the challenges and ideas that came from the workshop, and it also highlights recommendations for future work to address the microfibers issue. This report is now available on the Marine Debris Program website if you'd like to take a look and learn more. Sherry also mentioned to us the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act and how it has mandated a report to Congress on microfiber pollution, which the EPA is taking the lead on. The report will require a microfiber definition, an assessment of the sources and pathways, standardized methodology for measurements, and recommendations for reducing microfiber pollution. And then lastly, Amy Vieira from CSU Coast sent in a presentation to highlight some of the recently funded projects by them. They have 4 microplastic projects in the works. One of them is to assess the fate and toxicity of microplastics under coastal environmental conditions. Another is identifying micro and nanoplastics in aqueous samples using nano IR. And then they had another project, microplastic ingestion by commercially important fishes. And then the last one was to quantify effectiveness of bioretention in removing microplastics. So a lot of good work going on and a lot of good conversation along the research currently in plastics and microplastics and data and such. We can move on to the next slide, please. The next goal that I lead is the Goal 5 Behavior Change Work Group. And again, we had a few partner updates. So Grace Lee from Rethink Disposable came on to highlight some of their new education campaigns. They are working with Upstream and others on a consumer identity statement. This is so that consumers, you can say as a consumer that you are in support of reusables in food service. They also have a campaign called Reopen with Reuse to encourage the CDC to update COVID guidance to restaurants and allow more reusables and encourage restaurants to shift to reusables as they start to reopen. They are also trying to partner with apps to try to empower consumers to facilitate this type of change. Some of these app features include helping you as a consumer craft and send emails as sustainability reviews of restaurants, or give plastic scores to rate packaging for restaurants, with the end goal to hopefully get enough users so that maybe Yelp could incorporate these types of reviews into their system. And our group definitely was excited about these apps, and I thought they were a great idea. And then we had Sherry Lippiat again talk about the microfibers report, but more so in this goal was to discuss the messaging that came from it. So the microfibers workshop report, the take-home messages from the report were that you should be washing less, saying no to fast fashion, wash in cold water, and if can, install microfiber capture technology. And these are the suggestions that came from the report on how to reduce microfiber pollution. And then lastly, something that we spent a lot of time talking about in this work group was around campaign strategies and messaging. And an example that came from CPSC is that how the messaging shifts, right, from what we think as the driving factor is the environmental benefits. It was more so they like to highlight cost savings and business models. The example they gave was their reusable 1 pound propane canister campaign, and when Joanne from CPSC goes to market this to customers or to businesses, it's not really about the environmental benefits that she starts off with. It's more about the pitch about saving money and as being a new business model. So we were talking a lot about changing those messaging to your audience. And in addition, Surfrider San Francisco has a cigarette butt litter campaign that they're waiting to launch, but they would like to do that post-COVID. So a lot of good messaging coming out, but hopefully you can get it out soon. Next slide, please. The last work group I will be recapping for you today is the Goal 6 Ocean-Based Debris and Cleanup work group. So we started this conversation off about the fishing line recycling bin expansion project that takes monofilament fishing line and recycles it into benches, fishing boxes, and other fishing lines. And there was funding that was acquired to expand the project for the California Coastal Commission and the California State Parks to expand to add additional 50 bins across the state of California. And these bins essentially sold out in about 2 hours after posting the announcement, which is really exciting. We have a lot of encouragement around getting these bins to start collecting monofilament line, but it definitely led our group into a discussion around misuse and compliance, which is I guess often seen with these bins. We talked about how important outreach and signage is, how it can be hard for maintenance workers to have an additional bin to upkeep. And then we discussed how in the past there's been long-term success when these bins are partnered with community groups to upkeep them. And so some of the suggestions that came from these conversations were, maybe highlighting the importance of fishing line recycling in the CDFW newsletter that goes out to a lot of fishermen, or having an undergraduate or a capstone project to maintain and record changes in collections, collaborating with local disposal services beforehand so that maintenance is upkept, or maybe taking this as an opportunity to have sponsorship from companies who are making products from the recycled gear to pay for these bins to be upkept. So a lot of good discussion there. And then we had an announcement that crab fishermen are now required by CDFW to report how many pots are lost and in what location, and that this helps give an idea for cleanup and recovery. So how many to look for and where to look when we're recovering. And many people thought this was a great idea, especially some of the fishermen, were really on board with this, and thinks that this is a way to increase our accuracy and recovery. We had a success story from Courtney Opshog and the smart buoys. So we talked a little about how a smart buoy in Alaska moved too far on a captain's radar, and he was actually able to go and locate it, pick it up. It had gotten loose and could have ended up becoming marine debris, but because of the smart buoys, he was able to save his gear, save his money, and also we did not lose a lot of pounds of debris to the sea. So it was a really good success story there. And then lastly, an announcement from CINMS, the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, has secured their vessel days, and lobstermen are all lined up for the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary Get Into Your Sanctuary Week, which will be held in August. and the International Coastal Cleanup Day, or California Coastal Cleanup Day, which will be held in September. And so that we went through a lot of different topics in that work group, but that was it for us. And then next up, we have Cameron Kubos from the CPSC filling in for Joanne Brash, who is the lead on goals 1 and 2. And so she'll be giving those updates, which will also then lead into our state legislative updates. So I will pass it over to Cameron.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm Cameron. Like she said, I'll be filling in for Joanne, and I'll be providing a recap of the meeting that we had in February on work groups 1 and 2. Next slide, please. So a little bit about CPSC. We're the California Product Stewardship Council. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we educate and advocate for product stewardship. And our mission is to shift California's waste management system from government funded to producer funded, producer responsibility. So on the slide, you can see we are a small staff of 4, and then we have our 4-member board executive committee. And then next slide, please. And then the other members of our board. We have a very diverse board, representatives from rural, urban, cities, counties, and people from different backgrounds all across the state. Next slide, please. And just to cover our funders, and we always want to thank our sponsors, our associates, cities, counties, districts, and JPAs that make our work possible. And if you, we encourage you to join us to become more involved with producer stewardship in California. Next slide, please. So why did CPSC form in 2007? So we formed to work on environmental policies and legislation. We work with local governments and waste collectors on the issues that we face with the products that we see. So for example, so in the 90s, batteries were banned from the landfill, but here we are in 2021, we're still seeing batteries ending up in the landfill where they can leak acid and they can even cause fires. So these bans ultimately caused unintended consequences. There was no funding set aside for education or collection programs. So next slide, please. And this is our stewardship spectrum graphic. It's a tool to explain the differences between product stewardship and EPR, as they can sometimes be lumped together. So on the right side, you can see product stewardship. These programs are usually voluntary. There's usually a visible fee. So for example, when you buy tires, mattresses, some e-waste products like monitors, there'll be a fee that you can see that will go to handle the management of that product at end of life. And then on the towards the left, we have the extended producer responsibility. And this is usually mandatory where the industry is funding the program. And there's an end of life plan for their products. And usually the cost is embedded in the price of the product. And on the bottom, there's a few examples of where different products lie on this spectrum. Next slide, please. So for over 13 years, CPSC has been working on EPR, extended producer responsibility, and CPSC has been active with OLS. We met at the end of February. We had 20 participants from 16 different organizations. Our guest speakers included Doug, our executive director, Tina, the senior policy advisor to Senator Ben Allen. She gave an update on what Ben Allen's office is doing and reminded us that with virtual meetings, which are more accessible, it's important to call in to voice support on bills and legislation. And we also had Heidi Sanborn guest speak for us. So in 2020, CalRecycle appointed a statewide commission to discuss the problems with recycling in California. And so she gave an update on the CalRecycle commission report that came out last December. And those priorities in the report included defining recyclability and compostability. And if anyone wants notes from that last meeting, we can send those to you as well. And some campaign updates. So Upstream and Rethink Disposable are some of the groups that are leading campaigns. For example, we have the So for Reusable Foodware, Skip the Stuff campaign. which have resulted in local ordinances. And our next work group for goals 1 and 2 will be on August 24th at 10 a.m. and you can contact us to join. I'll have contact information on the last slide. Next slide, please. So going into the legislative update, so there are over 50 waste related or producer responsibility bills introduced in this legislative session. So it's really exciting to see. Senator Ben Allen is the chair of the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, and he's also leading a group of lawmakers who recognize the threats to public health and environment and creating a package of waste bills. And so there's a lot of other waste bills, local, state, and federal, that are not listed here, but I'll focus on the bills directly pertaining to ocean litter. And if you ever want to know more about the status of bills, you can go to our website or to LegInfo to see the latest updates. So to review some of the key bills, AB 478, Ting. So that's the minimum content bill that passed last session. So this is similar, yet it's focused on the thermoform containers, like the clamshell plastic containers. AB 622 and 802 both address microfiber filtration. So to add filtration to laundry. AB 818, so unflushable wipes. And this is truth in labeling, which is similar to SB 343, which is the chasing labels. So this is for education on the labels and correct labeling. AB 881, which is similar to AJR4, the Basel Convention, addresses unfair exports of post-consumer plastic to countries that don't have the infrastructure to manage it. AB 962, that is promoting reusable beverage containers by including them in incentives and not requiring glass to be broken to qualify for incentives. So this will really promote reuse, and it'll allow collection sites to participate. AB 1276. So this is building off of what's happening on the local level, like skip the stuff. And so this is accessories on request, silverware or plasticware accessories on request. And SB 54, that was the big bill from last year. That was holistically looking at plastics and packaging. That didn't pass. So this session, the Environmental Caucus has split up the bills into a package of plastic bills. And so moving forward, we'll have producer payments on different items that they will specify. So I will also put a link in the chat for the press release of Senator Ben Allen's, the package of waste bills that have a nice overview of what they're covering. And then SB 289, which addresses batteries and battery embedded products, are not often thought of as ocean litter, but they are embedded, and it's a direct environmental risk if the acid leaks out, and they also cause fires. And SB 289 is arguably one of the best EPR bills in this session because it's well thought out. It has CalRecycle's feedback. And so we're really excited to see how that moves along. And next slide, please. And thank you. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Cameron. So now we're going to turn it over to Angela Howe from Surfrider Foundation, who will be providing us with a federal legislative update.
Thanks, Holly. And I'm so glad that we had Representative Lowenthal on earlier, who, of course, is very helpful in describing federal legislation and the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which he helped put together with a ton of stakeholder outreach. So that is actually my first slide. Next slide, please. Kind of goes over this very comprehensive federal legislation. So originally it was introduced last year with Senator Udall. Senator Udall has since retired, so now Senator Merkley is on the Senate version of the bill, which is S984. And Representative Lowenthal is on the House version, HR 2238, and now has 92 co-sponsors in the House and a dozen co-sponsors in the Senate. And this groundswell of support is due to the great outreach they did to many stakeholders and the NGO community to help create this bill. So what it does, the basis of it is that it's using all of the good ideas that happened at the local and statewide level and putting that into a package of federal legislation. So it requires producers of packaging to come up with a system for recycling, so extended producer responsibility. It has a national beverage container refund system. It has a ban fee hybrid on plastic bags. So great things we've seen in states like California that have now made it to be proposed at the federal level. Next slide, please. Three major improvements that they've had in the 117th Congress has been extended producer responsibility. So really improving the criteria and the incentives to get that real circular economy up and running. Thinking about, you know, who takes the responsibility, where does the money go, how is it managed? And that I would say still isn't perfect, but is a great model at the federal level. In fact, it's so good that the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, that speaks to state legislators, took the federal model and made it into a memo so states can use it. And now we've had these types of bills introduced in over 12 states. So it's a really great interplay from the state level, the federal level taking good ideas, and then back down to the state level. It's a very organic system. Another wonderful thing this bill has is a pause on new permits, so pause on plastic production. We know that production facilities are sometimes located in low income and areas that have already been impacted by environmental justice concerns. So this would pause it under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And it calls for a study by the National Academy of Sciences to really start understanding the environmental justice and pollution impacts of these plastic production plants. So looking more at the full life cycle of plastics, we know a lot about how it harms the ocean, but what about the creation of plastics from fossil fuels and what that does to local communities? And then finally, in more of a global environmental justice lens, there's a ban on the export of waste to countries that just can't handle it. We know that a lot of countries want to take it and recycle it, but once the China Green Wall went up a few years ago, there's been too much waste exported to countries that don't have the infrastructure to handle it, and that creates leakage points into the ocean again. So it's a ban on the export or re-export of plastic waste to non-OECD countries, and requires consent for, if you want to export your waste outside of the nation, there still needs to be consent by those countries that are taking it. So we're seeing a lot of that. The AJR 4 and AB 881 that was just mentioned on the California legislation also focuses on that export of waste and not getting diversion credits for sending waste to other countries that aren't really recycling it. So next slide, please. So this slide has a few other bills that are up in Congress. We've actually seen a lot of legislation be introduced. It's very active Congress. So this isn't comprehensive, but these are some of the bigger bills. The first one is the Clean Future Act. So climate leadership and environmental action for our nation's future act. And this actually incorporates a lot of the Environmental Justice for All Act, a lot of really good things. However, it allows for waste incineration and that to be counted towards zero waste. And that is opposed by NGOs. So a lot of bills that are maybe bolstering recycling, but allowing for burning of waste or chemical recycling or unproven technologies, NGOs are trying to pause that and say, hey, wait a second, this isn't the right way to go about it. And first and foremost, we should focus on source reduction and not incentivize more and more production of plastics. So the next one is the Recover Act, realizing economic opportunities and values of expanding recycling. So that's actually bipartisan. and it gives a federal grant program of $500 million to local governments for improved recycling infrastructure. So kind of what I was just saying, but it's opposed by NGOs. It precludes funds from being used for incineration, so that's good, but there's no source reduction involved, and it allows for unproven technologies like chemical recycling. So that provision is opposed by NGOs. And then we have a new one, Plastic Waste Reduction and Recycling Act. So again, to optimize recycling and reusability. So waste reduction is included in this one, but it supports research and development of bioplastics and advanced recycling. So going to want to watch that one very closely and how that flushes out. And finally, much like last year, we have the Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act, which is a provision of the larger Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, but kind of taken this one part and introduced on Cinco de Mayo as a separate bill. So that prohibits the discharge of nurdles, these little pre-production plastic pellets, into waterways from facilities that make the plastic packaging. So that's it for federal legislation. I'll drop a couple other links in the chat so you guys know what else is being asked of the Biden administration and going on with stimulus funding.
Great, thanks, Angela. Next slide, please. So we are going to be moving on to agency updates. We don't have a lot of time to take questions over the Q&A right now, but I did want to mention that we had a number of folks point out that the state bill list was missing a bill, AB 1371 by Assemblywoman Friedman, which is aimed at phasing out single-use plastics in e-commerce and shipping. So just thought I would share that really quickly. We do have a number of comments in the Q&A if folks want to take a look at that. So for our agency updates, we're going to have one from the Ocean Protection Council, which I represent, the No Marine Debris Program, the Safer Consumer Products Program through the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and the State Water Resources Control Board. Next slide, please. So for the OPC, my update is going to cover three main categories. I'm going to talk a bit about the top 10 recommended actions to address plastic pollution that the council adopted back in February, some recently funded projects, and provide a short update on the microplastic strategy. Next slide, please. So as many of you know, at the February OPC meeting, the council amended and endorsed a set of top 10 actions to address plastic pollution. I'm not going to go through every single action today, but provide a few highlights. The first action that was in our list was really the big one, and it was to advance and inform policies that address plastic pollution and prioritize prevention and reduction. There's a lot of policies that are listed there, but the overall concept is to really push source reduction first and then focus on waste management for the remaining plastics. So for example, we mentioned developing source reduction, reuse, and refill goals, and then talk about post-consumer recycled content requirements as well. Two additional actions that are going to become projects include developing a feasibility report for reuse and refill systems in California, and a report on the feasibility of extended producer responsibility for packaging and food serviceware, and lessons learned for the best approaches to developing extended producer responsibility. We're working to start these projects, and I'll include updates at future webinars on their status and results. Finally, we have an action to partner with local governments, state agencies, and nonprofits to provide technical assistance and tools that assist with the implementation of comprehensive food serviceware ordinances by the end of the year. I'm working on what form this will take, but I plan to provide updates to this group in the future as this project gets off the ground. And I'm going to quickly put a link in the chat to the final staff recommendation that was endorsed for everyone. Next slide, please. So in terms of recently funded projects, OPC has provided funding to Upstream to develop a single-use foodware reduction toolkit and training program. The goal of this project is to provide resources, training, and an outreach hub to enable local governments and businesses to develop foodware ordinances from inception through implementation. The resources include model ordinances, information on reusable products, and on third-party reuse service providers. an outreach program for businesses in the food service industry, and the development of a restaurant outreach toolkit for community groups to use. This project relates to the Ocean Litter Strategy Action 1.1.8, which is develop a toolkit with materials and strategies to share with local and out-of-state advocates to aid in the process of banning common ocean litter items and to aid in the process of switching local governments and communities to reusable items. I've also previously mentioned that OPC has provided funding to the San Francisco Estuary Institute to do some research on microplastics. And this is really building off of one of the Ocean Litter Strategy actions around quantifying microplastics in stormwater and wastewater. And that was done as part of the San Francisco Bay Project. And one of their main findings was that stormwater contributes an enormous load of microplastics to the environment. So we provided funding for SFEI to conduct literature reviews and develop conceptual models for the different ways that microplastics are entering stormwater. The conceptual models focus on single-use food serviceware, cigarettes, and textile fibers. And this project is in addition to a similar one that's already funded through the Bay Area Regional Monitoring Program that focuses on tire fragments. The project is nearing completion, and we're expecting that a final report will be available for folks to look at by this fall. Next slide, please. So finally, I'd like to provide a status update on the microplastic strategy. The strategy is currently under development, and its contents are really shaped by the requirements of Senate Bill 1263. We're anticipating releasing a public draft of the strategy for comment in early to mid-September. And I also wanted to note that we have funded an OPC STAT working group, which is facilitated by Ocean Science Trust. And their charge was to develop a risk assessment framework, which is one of the pieces of the legislation, with a focus on using that framework for source reduction. The final report from that project is expected to come out tomorrow, so please keep an eye out, and I'll send it out through the Ocean Litter Strategy listserv once it's available. And I believe that is everything I have, so I will turn it over to Sherry.
Great, thanks Holly, and hi everyone again. So I'll be providing the NOAA Marine Debris Program update. Next slide, please. So the Save Our Seas Act 2.0 was signed into law in December of 2020. And NOAA is already making progress on many of the new mandates in the act. So the first thing, the law established a Marine Debris Foundation. And this is a charitable nonprofit organization that's set up to encourage, accept, and administer funding to enhance efforts to address marine debris. So the NOAA administrator will be appointing a 12-person board of directors for the foundation. So we are going to be looking for nominations for board members, and we're really hoping to get a good diversity of nominations across geography, demographics, affiliation, and career stage. So I'll be sending this announcement out to the Ocean Litter Strategy listserv. It should be within the next few days, and would really appreciate everyone's help promoting that as far and wide as possible. The limiting factor is that the opportunity is limited to US citizens. The next bullet is a report on US contributions to global plastic waste. And last year we funded the National Academies of Science to bring together a group of experts who have already gotten to work hosting a number of public meetings and are working on this report. Eben Schwartz, who presented earlier, is one of the committee members. And so that report should be ready by December of this year. And then the next two, I don't have much time to go into detail on, but we are working on a report on the sources and impacts of derelict fishing gear by both domestic and foreign fisheries. And then lastly, a study to look at the feasibility of a national fiberglass vessel recycling program, which will be based on a pilot project in Rhode Island. Next slide. And I'm excited to share some updates from our shoreline marine debris monitoring project, the Marine Debris Monitoring and Assessment Project. So this is a citizen science project focused on shoreline macro debris. So this is debris larger than 2.5 centimeters and focused farther downstream than the monitoring efforts that Shelley and Tony presented on earlier. But this project has been around for a little over a decade, and we just published an updated shoreline survey guide and launched a new database that has built-in visualizations and provides access to the data. So this is a screenshot here on the right side of the page. And Tanya, if you could paste the link to the database in the chat, folks can check it out if they're interested. Next slide, please. So the updates to MDMAP are based on a lot of insights and lessons learned from analyzing our data set, learning from other programs, and of course, collecting feedback from our participants and data users. So really quickly at a glance, the way that the program works is that participants choose their own shoreline location to establish a monitoring site. And then at each survey, they subsample the shoreline by randomly choosing and surveying 4 5-meter wide transects. These surveys can be done as part of a larger beach cleanup effort, but all of the details are explained in the survey guide. The data is then entered into our online data portal, and hopefully surveys are repeated on a regular basis, although that's not required. And so for now, we're considering this a soft launch as we work on creating some training videos and other resources, but definitely feel free to reach out if you're interested in getting involved. And then my next slide is my last slide, which is just a grant program update. So in FY22, we'll be announcing 2 grant opportunities, one for marine debris prevention projects and then one for marine debris removal projects. So these should be announced towards the end of the summer or the early fall. And again, I'll make sure to share those with the larger community. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Now we will turn it over to Ann Cooper Doherty from the Department of Toxic Substances Control Safer Consumer Products Program.
Great. Thanks, Holly. So as Holly said, I'll give you a brief update on our work. Next slide. So we essentially, for those of you who might not know, regulate chemicals and consumer products sold in California. So we have a 4-step process. An overview is here. You can go to our website if you'd like to learn more, or you can contact me, happy to discuss. And I'd also recommend, we have a timeline that we've just released in the last few months that gives a most up-to-date information about the different projects that we're working on, and that's updated quarterly. So recommend folks go to that. So for our work, though, essentially what we have to have is a chemical and a product that we then regulate. So we focus a little more on the chemicals that are coming out of these marine debris and a little less on the actual marine debris itself. Next slide. So the context for a lot of the update that I'm going to give is around our 2021 to 2023 priority product work plan. This is the 3-year menu, if you will, of the different product categories that we're going to be focusing on for the next 3 years. We will prioritize priority products from those product categories. So of note, this was just finalized in the last few weeks, I think, but of note in this most recent work plan is one of our priorities and considerations for implementation includes the potential for the product to release microplastics to the environment. So this is basically indicates our intent to focus on products that might be contributing to microplastic or marine debris in the environment. We're also participating in the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, or ITRC, microplastics team that's just started. So we'll be staying abreast of the latest research on that. So there are 3 product categories that I wanted to highlight in our work plan that relate to this. So next slide. The first is on building products and materials used in construction and renovation. This category was expanded from our last work plan to include products or materials used in outdoor settings. And we got a lot of feedback from stakeholders on that. And this explicitly includes artificial turf. So that's something that we intend to evaluate over the next 3 years. And as before, this will be primarily on the chemicals used or found in artificial turf, like PFASs. Next slide. We also have a whole food product category on food packaging. The revised definition for this version of the work plan has been expanded or modified a bit to include any food contact article that is used to package or serve. So once again, we're focusing on the chemicals found in this food packaging. We've done a decent amount of work on PFASs on a number of product categories, but also on food packaging. The specific proposal here focused on paper, paperboard, and molded fiber products. So we had a workshop related to this. We released a draft product chemical profile, and we're also following AB 1200 legislation regarding the use of PFASs in food packaging. Next slide. We've also had some workshop and done work on bisphenols in can and lid liners. And the next step with that is we're going to be starting an information call-in and hopefully near future to learn more about the chemicals that are used in liners. And we also did some research on orthophthalates in food packaging, which we are not pursuing at this time. And there's a document available on our website, or I can send as well, that explains the rationale for not moving forward on that. Next slide. And then our new product category, one of our new product categories in this work plan is motor vehicle tires. And a lot of this stemmed from a petition that we received in 2018 from the California Stormwater Quality Association, asking us to look in zinc in motor vehicle tires, primarily as a result of the tire particles that are generated and released to the environment. So we granted that petition and we released a rationale document in March, and that explained just our the overview of why we granted that petition. We have also since been following the work on 6-PPD, which is an anti-degradant used in tires, and the reaction product from 6-PPD quinone, 6-PPD, which is 6-PPD quinone, has been implicated as the cause of these really massive pre-spawn mortality events for coho salmon in Washington. They're acutely toxic. And that once again, the pathway for that, or one of the dominant pathways to that, is the generation of tire wear particles and their release to the environment. We've been working on a technical document on 6-PPD and motor vehicle tires and anticipate releasing that in the next month. And then all of this will culminate in a workshop this summer on zinc, 6-PPD, and other chemicals of concern that might be being released to the aquatic environment through tire wear particles. Next slide. So that is it. Welcome any questions, or feel free to email me directly or in the chat. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Anne. So now I will turn it over to Scott Coffin from the Water Board.
Alrighty, thanks, Holly. So I'm going to give a brief update on our work with microplastics. Go to the next slide, please. So we have two legislative mandates that require us to take action with microplastics. The first you've heard about a lot today, which is California Senate Bill 1263, which requires the Ocean Protection Council, in collaboration with the State Water Resources Control Board, to first initiate a statewide microplastic strategy in 2022, and then by 2026 develop a risk assessment framework, standardize methods, get some baseline occurrence data, investigate the sources of pathways of microplastics into the marine environment, and then recommend source reduction strategies back to the legislature. On the next slide, you'll see that these goals of Senate Bill 1263 are very similar to another bill. If we go to the next slide. So Senate Bill 1422, which was passed in 2018, has very similar requirements as 1263 in terms of first characterizing the risk, getting a standardized method, and doing some monitoring. And I'm going to give you a little bit of update on what we've been working on with this. July 1st of this year, we have a couple of requirements. One of this is to adopt a health-based guidance level to aid consumers in interpreting microplastics in their drinking water. Next slide, please. This is a quite similar goal to Senate Bill 1263's developing a risk assessment framework for microplastics in the marine environment. And because of these similar goals, we developed a similar process to accomplish these goals in tandem. On the next slide, you'll see that we've been holding a health effects workshop with a number of experts from around the world to dive into the available toxicity studies for mammalian as well as to aquatic ecosystem endpoints, trying to derive a regulatory threshold that could be used for both the marine environment and then a separate one for humans through the ingestion pathway for drinking water. This started October last year with a series of webinars that are recorded and online if you want to see them. And we're about to wrap up a lot of this work by about June of this year. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about another common goal between these two bills, which is to develop and adopt a standardized method for analysis of microplastics. Next slide, please. Similar to the requirement to adopt a standardized method in drinking water, we also need a standardized method to look for microplastics in the environment. Next slide, please. Again, we're performing these goals in tandem, and we have recently completed an interlaboratory calibration study with over 40 participating organizations from 7 different countries, highly intersector, as you can see here, with stakeholders from government, laboratories, academia, public water systems, as well as plastic producers themselves, instrument developers, so highly interdisciplinary, highly intersector. And we've been developing methods not only for drinking water, but also for ocean water, fish tissue, and sediment. The method for drinking water seems to be effectively finished at this time, but we're still wrapping up the study for the additional matrices. We should have a standard analytical method for these additional matrices by the end of this year. Next slide, please. So some preliminary findings that I can share with you all from this interlaboratory study for drinking water. We evaluated a number of methods and instrumentation, and very similar to what Tony has been saying in terms of there's a different method for a different purpose. So each method has its own strengths and limitations, and that you really want to choose the method based on your objective. That said, we have 3 methods that we believe to be well understood and are reproducible. These include microscopy, Fourier transform infrared, FTIR, as well as micro Raman, and we believe that these are good to go for drinking water right now. Next slide, please. Just to give you a brief overview of if you're thinking about size, as we learned from the trash monitoring work group, size matters. Microplastics size definitely matters quite a bit. And so you can see here generally the type of instrumentation that you would want for different size ranges and a little bit of insight into their associated costs. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing with our plan to adopt a 4 years of testing and analysis plan, again, due on July 1st of this year. Next slide, please. And so what we're thinking is a tiered monitoring framework, effectively where we have a surrogate method, something cheap and easy that many laboratories can do that would, above a certain threshold, would require additional monitoring using something like a bulk quantification microplastics by mass, something like pyrolysis GCMS. It's a little bit cheaper, or sorry, it's a little bit cheaper than FTIR and Raman, but it gives you a lot more information. It confirms the actual polymer type, gives you the mass. And then tier 3 would be necessary if you exceed a threshold for tier 2. This would be the full Monty using an actual micro Raman, micro FTIR. Again, these methods take a lot of time and are generally quite expensive, but they give you an adequate amount of information to assess the health impacts. Next slide, please. So this goal, developing a 4-year testing and analysis plan, is again similar to Senate Bill 1263's getting baseline occurrence data, which ties into investigating the sources and pathways. So if you can't monitor it, you can't manage it. And next slide, please. So in order to leverage the drinking water work that we've been doing for microplastics for the ambient ecosystem side, we have recently developed a concept of a monitoring and assessment playbook for microplastics. As you learned earlier today, we already have a monitoring and assessment playbook for trash, and we believe that there's currently methods available and that will be standardized this year that we have enough work to be able to actually discuss these and leverage these different objectives between different agencies. So we propose that we're going to initiate this playbook through a work group, a sub-work group of the California Water Quality Monitoring Council through their trash monitoring work group. A lot of you are already involved with that, but if not, you can feel free to join. This would be, again, consolidating efforts between different organizations, just for instance, DWR, Ocean Protection Council, State Water Resources Control Board. And we're anticipating that our first meeting will be around September of this year, by which time we will have adopted a drinking water method, and we may even have preliminary results from our additional matrices. And anyone is welcome to join. Please reach out to me if you're interested in being part of the conversation. And I think that's all that I have for today. Just want to thank you all for your attention and for coming.
Thank you, Scott. So now I believe we're moving into an open Q&A session. As of right now, we don't have any questions, but if anyone had a question come up as part of the legislative updates, or questions for the agency representatives that are here, or even, questions that came up later on from our guest speakers, please feel free to add them to the Q&A, and we've got some time to respond to those.
We have a question for Scott. If you can maybe put your email in the chat. That was just requested.
Sure, I can do that.
Ellie, I have a question. Going back to Tony and Shelley, if they're still here, I'm curious, kind of thinking about like the Star Trek effect. I'm wondering about if you got any feedback from the participants in the field on using the apps versus the paper data sheets, and whether that was part of the study. I know like a lot of, I guess NOAA is more focused on shoreline environments, and we hear from some folks that they're not comfortable using a phone or a tablet in a shoreline environment. So I'm just kind of curious if you collected any of that feedback, and if so, what it was.
Shelley, do you want to weigh in, or do you want me to?
Go for it, Tony.
I should say that we had a TAC, a technical advisory committee that advised us, and Sherry, you were on that TAC. And when we were first, and by the way, thank you very much, Sherry. Your comments were instrumental in helping us to improve the playbook. So I just want to be public about that. Thank you very much. But one of the things that we learned going into the project was that there was resistance to using apps. People had tried it in the past and failed. And part of it was because it's a dirty environment. When you're doing monitoring, you're in, especially in rivers and creeks, you have waders on, you're in mud, it's awkward. And so we knew that was the case, but at the same time, we knew that we could pair up different practitioners, one being in the water, one being not. So taking the device out of harm's way, as it were. And then also not investing so much in creating a whole new app, which I know people had tried in the past, but rather using off-the-shelf tools like Esri's Survey 123 to do it so that the cost investment was low. And so we were trying something that was not expensive to do. And it was effective. And also it had enough benefit for all the things it was able to collect, structure the data, capture imagery, capture location, be able to draw things on the device, be able to include training. So the trade-off was such that it was worth it to have that person who would be a dedicated scribe, not involved in the actual in situ monitoring, that the trade-off was very valuable. And we shared that information back with the TAC, even though the TAC originally had said, we don't advise using that. We like having paper as a backup. That was another reason why not to go with apps, is we like being able to go to paper as additional evidence. So if you go with the app, you don't have the paper evidence, but there are other steps you can take to make sure you have a backup, you have other sources. So I hope that answers your question, but there was some resistance to it. In the end, though, I should just say, just to cut to the chase, I know I didn't answer your question directly. People did, I think, really appreciate the results of the app. And we've now received feedback from BASMA that they're very interested in the app.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So it looks like we have a few questions coming in. The first one is for Eben, and it's what kind of coastal commission permits can plastic source reduction be integrated into, and just to give folks more of a sense of where they should be looking out for that if a certain permit comes before the commission.
Thanks. And that's a very good question that we hope to be able to answer once we start the project. I have to admit, one of the difficulties that we're going to have to overcome is that I'm not actually involved in the permitting process. Even I've been at the commission 20 years now, but it's just never been something I've done. So we're going to be pulling together a task force of staff people from across programs and across districts to investigate exactly that. Where are the intervention points in the permitting and the planning and the enforcement processes where plastic pollution reduction measures would make the most sense? So hopefully we'll have a better answer to that within the next 6 to 9 months, starting on July 1st, and I'll be able to report back on that at a future webinar.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we also have a question for Representative Lowenthal, who is unfortunately no longer on the line, but I think a number of us on the webinar could maybe speak to this, possibly Angela, but the question is, how would the US be holding the source of plastics responsible or accountable for end use, and what are the different ideas that are in place?
Sure, Holly. Yeah, I think that would go into that extended producer responsibility prong that we talked about of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So creating end markets, redesigning products so that they aren't easily littered. So whether that's connect the cap on water bottles, or making the package size reduced. Maybe you don't need 10 times the amount of packaging for the size of the product. So I think there's a lot of different things they can do, from redesign to setting up a capture system and a take back system. And it could be a whole webinar in and of itself, actually.
Agreed. Thank you. And it looks like we have another legislative question, and some of this proposed legislation focuses on recycled food packaging. Is there any legislation that's proposing that growers use recycled plastic in agricultural fields? So I don't know if Angela or Cameron, if you'd like to take this one.
I'm not familiar with that being a prong of it. I know that when you talk about recycled food packaging, another major issue that we're trying to tackle is toxics. And are you just recycling the toxics that are in the plastic to begin with? So that's something that the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act at the federal level is already looking out for. We want to start measuring and understanding that a little bit more. And comprehensive legislation that's been proposed in California, like SB 54, has also just begun to tackle that. I don't know of anything about growers using recycled plastic in fields, though.
Yeah. Awesome, thank you. All right, if there are any other questions, now's the time to add them to the Q&A. Looks like we've answered everything so far.
I'm impressed that, and just want to thank all of our speakers for staying on time today. We had a lot of folks presenting, so.
Yeah, I think since there aren't any further questions, I think we should wrap up. Thank you everyone for your participation and for joining us today for the Ocean Litter Strategy Update webinar. Our next update is going to be in around 6 months. We haven't set a specific date yet, but likely in November. So with that, thank you all, and we will see you in 6 months.